For today's video, we're going to learn how to find the volume of the sphere, and I'm going to go over two problems from your worksheet to help you get started. So this is problem number one. They want us to round our answer to two decimal places, and they also want us to use pi is equal to 3.14. To find the volume of a sphere, it's very similar to the cylinder and the cone. There's a formula that we use, and as long as you know the formula, all you need to do is plug into it, and you can reach your answer. Except the volume of the sphere is slightly different from the cone and the cylinder. It's v equals 4/3 pi r to the third power. And if you remember your cone and cylinder formulas, this should look quite strange to us. Because for the cone and the cylinder, it wasn't r to the third, it was r to the second. If you're curious and want to know where this formula comes from and why it's r to the third now, I will explain that at the end of the video. If you don't care and you just want to know how to use this formula and you want to know how to solve the problems, once I do the two examples, you can just close the video out. So now that we have the formula, let's go and use it to solve our problem. So to use this formula, I need to know what the radius is. And if you're good at the cone and cylinder problems now, this should be pretty easy for you to find the radius of the sphere. It's very similar. I look at the center and I ask myself, what is half the distance across? In this case, it's 4, so my radius or my r is 4. I'm now going to plug that in, and I'm going to plug in pi. I'm going to plug in 3.14 for pi. I have 4/3 times 3.14 times 4 to the third power, or what we can say is 4 cubed. Just like the cylinder and cone problem, I'm going to start with the exponents. 4 to the third means 4 times 4 times 4, which gives me 64. And 64 times 3.14 will give me 200.96. So what I need to do now is multiply 200.96 times 4 over 3. This just means multiply by 4, and whatever answer I get, I then divide by 3. And if we do it correctly, you get 267.94 and some other decimal values that we don't really care about because we're going to round to the nearest hundredth, or what we call 2 decimal places. So to round, we look at what our second number is after the decimal. In this case, it's a 4. And then we look at what numbers after the 4 to decide, are we going to round up or are we going to stay the same? If the number after the 4 is 5 or bigger, that means we're going to round up. In this case, it is. So we're going to round the 4 up to a 5. So our final answer is 267.95. And thus remember to write our units at the end. Since we were talking about inches, our volume will be inches cubed. Now let's go and look at number 4. For this example, we don't give you a picture, but we use the same exact formula. And this time they tell us what the radius is. They tell us that the radius is 7. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to begin by writing my formula. And I recommend that you do this all the time when you're starting volume problems, is writing the formulas, because the more you write it, the easier you're going to remember it. You can't do these problems unless you know the formula. In the future, yeah, you can Google it, but if you're taking a test, you have to know it. You have to bring it up out of your brain on your own with no notes. You have to know the formulas. So I know that the radius is 7. That was given to me in the problem, and now I'm ready to plug in. So I'm now going to have 4/3 times 3.14 times 7 to the third power. I'm going to take care of the exponents first. 7 to the third power means 7 times 7 times 7. That gives me 343. And 343 times 3.14 will give me 1077.02. So once again, to take care of this part, I do 1077.02 times 4. Whatever answer you get, you then divide by 3. And if you do it correctly, you'll get 1436.02 and some change. I need to round to the nearest hundredth, which means 2 numbers after the decimal point. In our case, it's a 2. I now look at the number after. Since it's a 5 or bigger, I round up, and I get 1436.03. And lastly, don't forget my units, inches cubed. Okay, now that if you're curious about the formula, let's go and look at where this comes from. I'm going to do something very similar to the cone video. I'm going to take a cylinder and a sphere, and they have the same radius and height. And I'm going to go and take that sphere, and I'm going to place it inside of the cylinder. And what I'm curious to know is, how much room does that sphere take up? Does it take up half of it, 3/4 of it, or does it take up 98% of it? I'm curious, I want to know. And why I want to know is it's going to allow me to create a formula for the sphere. If you remember, the cone took up 1/3 of it, meaning I could take 3 cones and place it into the cylinder. And we can figure this out with the same way I did the cone. I can pour water into the sphere, and I can then pour that sphere into the cylinder, and I can figure out how much space it took up. And it turns out the sphere has 2/3 the volume of the cylinder. I'll post a video in the description that shows why this is. And what that means is that the sphere, we can fit 1.5 of them into the cylinder. So once again, the cone was 1/3 the volume of the cylinder, which meant we could fit 3 cones into the cylinder. The sphere is 2/3 the volume of the cylinder, meaning we could fit 1.5 of them into the cylinder. We can now use this to create a formula for the sphere. The volume of the sphere will be 2/3 the volume of the cylinder. Once again, it's 2/3 because it took up 2/3 of room. The cone was 1/3, the cylinder is 2/3. And now I can plug in what the volume of the cylinder is. That's just simply pi r squared h. And now I'm going to ask myself, what is the height of a sphere? Well, that's just the line that goes straight up and down through the center. And we've seen this in the previous video when we did the cone. This is what we call the diameter. When we have a line that goes all the way across to the center, that's called the diameter. And the diameter is just the radius times 2. If half the distance is 4, then the entire distance will be double that, which will be 4 times 2, in this case 8. So the diameter is the same thing as 2 times r, or 2 times the radius. And now I'm going to use my 8th grade chapter 1 skills, my exponent properties. I see that I have the base r and I have the base r. And this one's raised to the second power while this one's raised to the first power. And when we're multiplying with the same base, I add the exponents. So I'm going to do 2 plus 1, and that'll give me an answer of 3. I also just took the 2 and wrote it in the front because good math grammar says to write your number in front of your variables. And lastly, what I can do is I can do 2 times 2 over 3. 2 times 2 gives me 4. 3 times 1 gives me 3. So my final answer is 4 over 3 pi r cubed, which is the formula that we just used to solve the 2 other problems. In fact, you guys can also use the formula up here. If you can remember that the height is the same as the diameter, the height of the sphere is the same thing as the diameter of the sphere. If you can remember that, it might be easier for you to use this formula because it's very similar to the other ones. The cylinder was simply pi r squared h. The cone was 1/3 pi r squared h. And now the sphere will be 2/3 pi r squared h. So as long as you remember this part of the formula, you can remember the cone and the sphere rather simply. All you need to do is put a 1/3 or 2/3 in front.